For decades, Canada's economy has lived in America's shadow, dependent, cautious, waiting for approval before taking the next step. But on this day, something broke. Something historic. Mark Carney stood before the nation and declared what no Canadian leader had dared to say in generations: Canada is economically independent. That statement didn't just echo across Ottawa, it sent a shockwave through Washington. For the first time in modern history, Canada wasn't adjusting to American decisions, it was rejecting them. And the reason Carney gave was blunt: Donald Trump's America is unpredictable, short-sighted, and dangerous for Canada's future.
Before moving forward, do subscribe for Parliament updates.
From that moment, the tone changed. The speech wasn't defensive. It wasn't polite. It was confident, almost defiant. Carney made it clear that Canada would stop reacting to chaos south of the border and start building its own destiny. And how? By launching one of the boldest national projects since the post-war era, Build Canada Homes, a federal-led housing revolution meant to slash building times by half, cut construction costs by 20%, and lower emissions at the same time. This wasn't a dream. It was a blueprint for an entirely new economic engine, built on Canadian resources, Canadian labor, and Canadian pride. He described a nation tired of waiting for foreign capital, tired of being told what's possible and what isn't. The Canada Carney envisioned was a builder's nation again, a country of risk-takers, inventors, and problem-solvers. And this time, the goal wasn't just to survive global markets. It was to control them. The Build Canada Homes plan would transform federal lands into high-density, modular housing hubs. Factories would churn out components on an industrial scale: Canadian steel, Canadian wood, Canadian innovation. The homes themselves would be proof that this country could take care of its own citizens without depending on American real estate cycles or foreign investors buying up property. And this wasn't a symbolic gesture, it was the opening move in a new economic doctrine. Carney called it the Buy Canadian policy, a mandate that every dollar of federal spending must prioritize Canadian suppliers first. No exceptions. No vague promises. The best efforts era was over. Every department, every Crown corporation, every major project, from high-speed rail to defense manufacturing, would start with one question: can this be made in Canada? For years, the phrase "made in Canada" was a marketing tagline, something slapped on a label to feel patriotic. But under Carney, it became a governing principle. An economic weapon. He drew a sharp contrast between two paths: austerity and ambition. One path meant more cuts, more waiting, more dependency, letting foreign capital dictate our fate. The other path meant investing big, in housing, in infrastructure, in clean tech, in innovation. We can choose to follow, he said, or we can choose to build. And suddenly, it wasn't just policy talk, it was a rallying cry. For the first time in years, Canadians were being asked to believe that their economy could stand on its own legs. That our industries could compete. That our workers could lead. Carney's message wasn't nationalist in the Trumpian sense. It wasn't about closing borders or fueling resentment. It was about reclaiming agency, about a country that had spent too long being the polite junior partner finally deciding to act like a major power. He framed it as a shift in mindset: no more waiting for permission, no more reacting to Washington's moods. From this point on, Canada would write its own rules. And to prove it, Carney pointed to the very sectors that once defined Canada's dependence on the U.S., like forestry. He cited New Brunswick, where 3/4 of forestry exports still go south of the border. A single tariff or political tantrum from Washington could devastate thousands of Canadian workers. That, Carney said, ends now. Canada would boost domestic production, expand trade with other markets, and negotiate from strength, not desperation. It was a moment loaded with symbolism, because forestry is more than an industry, it's part of Canada's identity. And Carney was telling Canadians that identity didn't belong to the United States anymore. But this wasn't just rhetoric. He announced that Canada would invest up to $1 trillion in building a self-sufficient economy, a once-in-a-generation reinvention designed to make Canada economically unshakable. The plan would pour money into clean energy, national manufacturing, AI, housing, and transport, but above all, it would ensure that every dollar spent built strength at home, not dependency abroad. For decades, Ottawa treated trade with the U.S. like a lifeline. Under Carney, it became just one of many options. He said plainly that the U.S. was now governed by short-term politics, not long-term vision, and Canada couldn't afford to bet its future on unpredictability. That was the spark of the transformation, a clear statement that Canada would no longer play defense. He wasn't angry. He wasn't emotional. He was resolved. And that calm confidence made the message even more powerful. Because when he said, "Canada doesn't need permission for its future," the chamber went silent. It wasn't a boast, it was a declaration. This wasn't just about economics anymore. It was about identity. About who Canada chooses to be when it's no longer defined by proximity to the United States. And for millions watching, it felt like the start of something bigger, not just a new policy, but the birth of a new national era. When the applause finally settled, Carney wasn't finished. What came next turned a declaration into a movement. He revealed the full scope of the trillion-dollar investment plan, a vision so vast it redefined the role of government itself. Housing, infrastructure, clean energy, artificial intelligence, and manufacturing, each pillar connected by one idea: control our own destiny. Every dollar spent would be a brick in the wall of economic sovereignty. Not a wall of isolation, but a foundation of independence. Carney's tone sharpened as he drew a clear line between reaction and creation. For too long, Canada's economic strategy had been reactive, waiting for U.S. demand, foreign buyers, or global markets to make the first move. But that model, he said, left the country exposed to every foreign storm. The new model was about building shelter, not chasing sunlight. And the timing couldn't have been more symbolic. As Washington shifted unpredictably under Trump's erratic trade wars and political calculations, Canada was choosing something rare: stability through strength. Not the kind of strength that comes from military power, but the strength of a nation that knows who it is and what it can produce. The plan wasn't built on ideology, it was built on realism. The world, Carney argued, is entering an era of economic nationalism whether we like it or not. Every country is protecting its own, from the United States to China, from Germany to Japan. So why shouldn't Canada do the same, but in its own way? He called it responsible nationalism, a version rooted not in fear but in confidence. In a belief that a country of 40 million could set its own direction and still thrive in a competitive world. Under the plan, Canadian companies would be given incentives to manufacture domestically. Universities and AI labs would receive record funding to ensure Canada wasn't just catching up, but leading the next industrial wave. The federal government would act as a long-term investor, not just a regulator, guiding private capital into national priorities instead of speculative profits. Then came the emotional crescendo, the point where policy turned into purpose. Carney looked directly into the cameras and said Canada no longer needs to wait for anyone's approval, not Washington's, not Wall Street's, not the IMF's. The era of polite dependency was over. Canada, he said, is not a satellite. It's a sovereign star. The line exploded across social media within minutes. To some, it was pure rhetoric. To others, it was a statement of rebirth. But either way, everyone understood the message: the old Canada, cautious and compliant, was gone. The new Canada was assertive, proud, and unapologetically independent. That shift was more than symbolic. It was structural. The Buy Canadian policy wasn't just a slogan, it was already reshaping contracts, budgets, and industrial planning. For decades, Canada's procurement system had favored foreign suppliers under the illusion of efficiency. Now, the balance was reversing. Factories in Ontario and Quebec were ramping up. Western provinces were drawing new deals for clean energy manufacturing. Northern regions, often ignored, were being integrated into the national supply chain. Carney's government framed this not as protectionism, but patriotism with purpose, the belief that every major nation must be able to feed itself, house itself, defend itself, and innovate for itself. And Canadians were listening. For years, the national conversation had been one of frustration, high housing prices, stagnant wages, political division. Now there was a vision big enough to unify the noise. Still, the skeptics didn't vanish. Critics accused Carney of economic overreach, of taking risks that could isolate Canada from its largest trading partner. But even they couldn't ignore the numbers. Foreign investment in Canada was beginning to climb, not fall. Domestic manufacturing was rebounding. Confidence was returning to sectors long written off as obsolete. What Carney was engineering wasn't just policy, it was psychology. He understood that nations, like people, only grow when they stop defining themselves by someone else's approval. And that's what this entire declaration was about. Not hostility toward the United States, but emancipation from its gravitational pull. The tone of his address made that distinction crystal clear. He didn't curse Washington. He didn't mock Trump. He simply stated a fact: America's politics are unpredictable, and Canada can no longer afford to be predictable in response. This wasn't rebellion. It was maturity. And as he described the long-term impact, new cities built from modular housing, AI-driven industries powering remote regions, energy independence through Canadian innovation, the scale of the moment began to sink in. For the first time since Confederation, a Canadian leader wasn't talking about partnership with the U.S. He was talking about parity. That was the quiet revolution hiding inside Carney's calm delivery. For 150 years, Canada defined its strength by proximity to American power, as an ally, a neighbor, a loyal participant. Now the message was simple: we will be partners but equals. In that single speech, Carney had redrawn the psychological border between the two nations. The physical one may remain invisible, but the mental one had just been reinforced with steel and conviction. And in homes across the country, people felt it: the farmers, the factory workers, the engineers, the students. They weren't hearing another politician talking about deficits and numbers. They were hearing someone say, "You build this country, and it's time we act like it." As his final words echoed through the hall, Carney paused, not for applause but for gravity. "Our future," he said, "is not something to be negotiated. It's something to be built." It was less a statement than a mission. In the days that followed, media headlines around the world called it everything from bold to reckless. Washington's silence spoke volumes. The White House didn't issue a statement, and it didn't need to. The message had already landed. Canada had changed direction. And there was no going back. In Ottawa, officials began rewriting procurement rules. Provincial premiers held emergency meetings to align new production targets. Companies that had once looked abroad for opportunity were suddenly bidding on domestic contracts. The economy was shifting, but so was the mood. Pride was replacing pessimism. And as night fell over Parliament Hill that day, Canadians weren't just celebrating a speech. They were witnessing the start of something larger, a rebirth of purpose. Carney's declaration wasn't the end of dependency. It was the beginning of identity. Because real independence doesn't come from borders or treaties, it comes from belief. And for the first time in a generation, Canada believed again.
Canada debates.